Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility's 2015 spring event, The New School Divested, Now What? My name is Brant Weathers. I'm an economics PhD student at NSSR and a research assistant at the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility, and I'll be your moderator today. With me are a host of financial and environmental experts that I will introduce shortly, and you, the wonderful audience that has joined us for this fascinating conversation and networking event. And also, we are having this event recorded, so it'll be available publicly as soon as possible. I'd like to make a plug for the University Student Senate, which fully sponsored our snacks and our film crew to record this event. So for those of you that are catching up, this event is meant to further an important conversation at the New School. This topic is called fossil fuel divestment. But what it really means is how a university decides to use its resources to address climate change. And the New School this spring made a public commitment to divest its endowment from fossil fuels, which is great. But if history has taught us anything, we know the devil is in the details. And so how do we take this commitment to rid ourselves of investments in coal, oil, and gas, and increase its impact towards the most important goal of all, a more sustainable society? All that said, today you will hear from the Chief Operating Officer of the New School, Tokunbo Shibawal, who will speak up to the topic, where are we and what's at stake? And then we will turn it over to our panelists, who will take about 10 minutes to answer the question, how do you think the New School can most effectively take advantage of the university's recent commitment to divest from fossil fuels? Our four panelists who will be addressing this question cover a range of skills and professional experiences. These include Chris Fowle, Vice President of Investor Initiatives at CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project; Marcy Smith, Executive Director of the Responsible Endowments Coalition; Paul Alexander Crystal, Director of Treasury at the Natural Resources Defense Council; and our very own Ian Howland, Research Assistant at the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility. We are thrilled to have each of you and look forward to your comments. After we've heard from this group, we will turn to the audience and ourselves to ask more specific questions on any details that may be of interest to those present. And finally, once that's done, we'll have at least a half an hour to enjoy more of the delicious food from Fairway, coffee from Breads, and a chance to meet and network with some of the finest professionals in the field. At 8 p.m. we'll be done and hopefully full of both newfound wisdom and food. With that, I turn over the mic to our COO, Tokunbo Shibawal. Tokunbo?
Thanks, Brant, and thanks to our panelists for joining us. It's great to have a good discussion on this because I think, as the title of the event implies, this is an ongoing process. So committing to divestment really is only maybe not the first step, but it's an early step in this process, and the devil is in the details. So I think the 3 points I would like to discuss as we talk about where are we and how do we get here and what does it mean for the university. First is that it really has been and needs to continue to be a very inclusive process. Second is that divestment and this process must be a reflection of the deeper values of the university, not something which is sort of tacked on the end, but really reflects who we are as a university. And third is that divestment, more broadly, climate action, is really as much a design problem as it is a social and political problem. And those three are deeply linked, but I think it's important to have this conversation about that broader context. So first, about the inclusive process. Brant and one of the panelists, Ian, are the graduate research assistants for the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility. This committee was established back in 2010, and in itself, its makeup is a representation of the inclusive nature. It includes representation from faculty, students, and staff at the university, and there's an equal representation from those three groups, really to guide the investment committee, which consists of trustees, to provide them guidance in terms of how to invest the university's endowment in accordance with the university's values. And so that inclusive process really was, the ACIR as it's known, was really a driving force in that. So it engaged a lot of students, faculty, and staff, and trustees as well. There are also two trustee members. So it really isn't representative of the entire university community. And that's been important as we've gone through this process. The ACIR first discussed this in 2013 in the spring, then subsequently brought this to the investment committee that fall, and then through a course of discussions over the course of the year, brought that to the Board of Trustees, and ultimately, I think the most important part of this is that the Board of Trustees said this is a really important issue, that being climate change, but we really want to challenge the university as a whole, the whole university community, to come up with a solution which is not just about investments, but really reflects the university as a whole. And I think that, again, is reflective of what this should mean for the university as we go forward. So that's the second point about being representative of our deeper values university. So I'm just going to read a quote from our mission. As everyone knows, the university has long been a very progressive leader in education, socially, et cetera, from its inception nearly 100 years ago. So an excerpt from our mission. The new school prepares students to understand, contribute to, and succeed in a rapidly changing society, and thus make the world a better and more just place. So obviously, addressing climate change is part of making the world a better place. But I think that the vision speaks a little more specifically to this. Again, another excerpt. We should be design and social research should drive approaches to studying issues of our time, such as democracy, urbanization, technology, technological change, economic empowerment, sustainability, migration, and globalization. And in that, creativity, innovation, and desire to change the status quo should be one of the tools. And secondly, social engagement to solving problems and contributing to the public good. So really, climate action is a case study in an issue of our time and really employing all of those tools, most notably the combination of design and social research to address a problem. So in this sense, divestment was a perfect match for the university because it's not something which is sort of ethereal on the side. It's really core to who we are as a university of addressing critical issues of our time and engaging design and social research collectively to address these issues. So I think in that sense, it represents a real opportunity for the university, not just to be a leader in divestment, but to really engage the issue of climate action more broadly and use divestment as an entree into a lot of other issues. And so you've seen that Joel Towers, Executive Dean Towers at Parsons, and Dean DePass at Milano have really seized the lead. And next week there'll be a formal relaunch of the Tishman Environment Design Center to talk about all the issues and all the ways in which the university community as a whole can engage on climate change. And that really is critical. Divestment has been an entree onto that. And I think if you looked at the public reception to our commitment to divest, it's been, I think, much more meaningful and not brushed aside as something kind of as a token gesture because we are engaging as a university as a whole. And so I think that's the real opportunity, is to engage this issue not simplistically, but really holistically. So I think third, the final point is really that divestment is a design challenge. So there's a political issue of what do you do, but then once you decide you're going to do it, how do you do it? And that's really, again, the devil being the details and where we are now. And in fact, Brant and Ian, and I think Ian will speak about this, one of the real challenges is measuring progress. And part of the issue has been that it's been a very binary issue. So for the most part, in the public consciousness, divesting is a discussion about 200 stocks that 350.org and others have defined as sort of the bad stocks or the most concentrated in fossil fuels. We all know that this is a spectrum of gray. And so one of the challenges, and this is where, again, the research work within the ACR is helping inform a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be invested in fossil fuels. So there's something that they're developing, which is an index of basically the intensity of carbon investment, which is both how much a given company is involved in the fossil fuel extraction, but also how dirty is the carbon. So obviously, tar sands are different than natural gas. And we really should be a more nuanced understanding of this. The second really critical issue is that the marketplace for fossil-free investments is still developing. And so the investment committee is advised by Slocum, it's our management company, and they have basically advised the investment committee that right now the pool of managers in this space is relatively limited, but that's something we expect to evolve over time. And the university's role can really be enhanced here by pushing in the market and advocating. This is why it's important to speak to other institutions that are interested in divesting to further develop the marketplace of investment managers who are working in this space. Because ultimately, the mechanics that people don't realize is most endowments do not directly hold stocks, except for the very large ones, the Harvards and Stanfords of the world. Most hold commingled funds. So there's an investment in a manager. We pick a manager who then in turn picks a series of investments. And so we need, in order for us to divest, we need to be able to identify managers who are doing the same thing. And again, we want managers not who are divesting of fossil fuels, but actually are effective managers of our money. Because first and foremost, the investment committee's responsibility is to maintain the endowment, because that's critical to paying for the university, for paying for scholarships, paying for tenured faculty, et cetera. So it's all well and good to divest of fossil fuels, but if we pick a manager who does really poorly, then that essentially limits our ability to provide financial aid and other things that are critical to the university. So we have to develop the marketplace and identify managers who can manage our funds on our behalf, as well as divest from the stocks, which are the target stocks. So this is kind of a dual process of evolving our thinking and giving a better measurement, but also building a marketplace of managers who can manage our investments in the way that we wish. And I guess the final piece I think that's critical in this area is that as a global investments, it's easier, and you've seen in the U.S. and in FTSE, the British Stock Exchange already has developed a fossil-free index. But it's going to be a greater challenge, I think, in the developing world where extractive industries are a greater percentage of the economy. So if you go to the Middle East or Nigeria or Venezuela or many of these developing countries, oil is a huge part of the economy. So it's harder to find investments in those types of that part of the stock market that are fossil fuel free. So this is going to be an evolving process, just as we're thinking about design solutions to how we as a university community lower our carbon impact, find sustainable transportation, print less paper, et cetera. There are also design solutions associated with our investment strategy as a whole. So I think that's the big thing to think about here, that this is, again, there's the political will to do it, but then there's really a design solution. How do we design solutions? And this is important not just for the university, but as a leader for others. Because one of the things holding other institutions back from divesting is that they don't know how to go there. And some of the panelists and I were just talking beforehand about the conference that some of us attended last year, and a lot of institutions are searching about for how do they do this. And so part of our role and the opportunity we have is to help blaze a path by clearly defining how to do this in a way which is sustainable, not only from an environmental point of view, but from the fiscal responsibility point of view. So with that, I look forward to a good discussion and look forward to hearing from the panelists.
Thank you, Takimbo. I think we're now ready to dive into the issue. So to the panelists, I will reiterate the basic question of this event, which is, based on your personal expertise, how do you think the New School can most effectively take advantage of the university's recent commitment to divest from fossil fuels? Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to talk. I also have slides to keep them on track with the number of minutes. But with that, we will start with Chris Fowl from CDP, formerly of the Carbon Disclosure Project. Chris.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the New School and the ACIR for having me. What I wanted to do was spend a few minutes in sort of setting the context for what CDP is, and with that, provide you with some insight into how I think your investment strategies with relation to divestment can take advantage of some of the information that we provide, and the status that you have as an investor signatory to CDP's various programs. So let me just describe what we do and what we make available to those that become involved, as the New School's endowment has, as an investor signatory to CDP. We go out to companies and cities and supply chains around the world and ask them to give us information on an annual basis. And this is across climate, water, forests, and as I said, cities. And we now have more than 5,000 companies reporting to us. We've got more than 70 supply chain members. So what that means is a large company like Walmart works with us to then identify companies in their supply chain that they'd like to report to them on climate and water risks. Our newest supply chain member, in fact, is the United States government. The General Services Administration recently joined us about a month ago to help, and they're the largest procurer in the United States. To help them get a handle on climate risks within their supply chain. We've also got more than 200 cities reporting to us as part of our Global Cities program, and that is on target to hit 500 in the next couple of years. And then the program that I sit in is the Investor Initiatives program, and we've got 822 at last count investors around the world representing more than $95 trillion in assets under management. And those investors are the ones that give us the authority to go to companies, including oil and gas companies and companies in high-emitting sectors, and ask for information that becomes part of the equation in making the difficult investment decisions. And to Kumbo's points about climate action and figuring out the details around where you're going to go, I think despite the fact that there are going to be some companies that you will divest of, as defined by the Carbon Underground, the fossil fuel, the 200 dirtiest companies as identified by 350.org and others, there will be a lot of other companies that you will remain invested in that we're also collecting information on that can help inform you and your asset managers, the ones that you choose in the next generation of asset managers as you described. So So let me just explain a little bit about how it works. We sit in the middle. We have the authority of an ecosystem of information. We get the authority from investors to collect information from companies, and then we make it available to investors, as I've described. And so this is the disclosure process that we run. One might ask, why disclosure? Why does that help? Why not just divest? Why is the information that you gain from disclosure important? And Christiana Figueres has described CDP as to the future of business, as the X-ray was to the then future of medicine. Without it, we'd never be able to see the insides of the patient's health, right? There are different fuel types, there are different operating models, different geographies that have implications for the climate risks, the water risks, the deforestation risks that we're trying to understand as part of our portfolios, as part of the New Schools portfolio. So divestment or engagement. And CalPERS, which some of you may have heard of, is the largest public pension fund in the US and California, and their CEO has said that CDP provides investors with data and analysis they need to make informed decisions and allows them to pool their resources to create unifying voice and a push for sustainability. And importantly, I think in this whole debate around divestment or engagement, CalPERS is a leading pension fund, largest pension fund, and they've stated that they're not going to do divestment. They're more about engagement. So they are invested in literally every publicly listed company in the world, and their philosophy at this point anyway is, if I divest, then I'm not at the table. I'm not able to get that deep dive understanding of what a company's operations are and hopefully change corporate behavior, because that's CDP's mission, and that's aligned with CDP's mission. We want to change corporate behavior. There is momentum gaining around these around the investment debate about engaging versus divestment, as you well know, and again, I applaud you for being a leader in this space. Pension funds are being urged to disclose their climate risks, said the Financial Times last June. A university there in the UK talked about the ability to measure and monitor emissions within investment portfolios, and we see that as a key step in understanding where you are and making decisions about divestment. I'll talk quickly about two particular initiatives that we're supporting that help investors make those decisions and do the analysis around carbon intensity, climate risks related to the carbon intensity. So think of a footprint, portfolio carbon footprint of a company, just like an individual has a footprint depending on how much you drive or how much you fly, et cetera. Companies obviously have the same thing, and we ask them to provide us with climate or carbon accounting information. What are their emissions? And then you can use that information to develop metrics on a portfolio-wide basis to get at least a rough understanding of how carbon intensive your portfolio is. And I said there are two initiatives that we're supporting. The first is the Montreal Pledge. It's called the Montreal Pledge because it was announced last year at the UNPRI. PRI stands for Principles of Responsible Investing, so it's a United Nations initiative. And at their conference last year in Montreal, they announced an initiative to get pledges from investors to undertake a portfolio carbon footprint. So that measurement of that carbon intensity of a portfolio as a tool to make investment decisions, and we support those investors that are making the commitment to do that. Then what I call the sort of intermediate step or next evolution is an initiative that we are a co-founder of, and it's called the PDC. It just so happens to be CDP backwards. We didn't design it that way, but the Portfolio Decarbonization Coalition is a pledge that investors can make to take that next step. And that could include divestment at one end of the spectrum, and it could also include engagement at the other end, or something in the middle. As Takumbo said, the devil's in the details, and every portfolio, every asset manager, every endowment is going to have a different approach to what this means, and that could evolve over time. But the PDC is meant to be a clearinghouse of best practices and a way for leading investors around the world to get together to understand what it might mean and to make the commitment to decarbonize their portfolios. Now I want to turn a little bit to the question that I was asked, which is about what can students do, how can they get involved, how can they utilize some of the tools that are available, the data that we have. You're an investor signatory to CDP. We have a lot of information. One way that we've helped students at certain universities, and this was something that we did for some students at Harvard last year, was around the 200 companies that were mentioned, the so-called carbon underground, fossil fuel indices, universe of 200 companies, identified as ones that should be divested of because they're carbon intensive. We analyzed that universe of 200 companies versus what companies are disclosing to CDP. And last year, 78, or about 40% of those companies responded to CDP. And we think that's going to go up slightly this year. So there's a universe of companies that there's a robust set of information around that students could use to really do a deep dive into what are the risks and opportunities, what are the governance strategies of those companies, what are their carbon footprints, what is the intensity of the versus other companies in their sector of what they're doing. What are they saying? This is voluntary disclosure. So what are they saying about what they're doing, and how can you use that to convince your responsible investing committee to take a closer look at this at a particular company? How could you speak to that company to get additional information? You're going to want to speak to them from a position of strength and understanding of what they're actually doing in their own words, based on a common set of questions and criteria that we supply to the market. And then, of course, we also encourage investors to get those non-responding companies to respond to us. So that 60% that didn't respond as part that are part of this Carbon Underground 200, we want to respond. So that's one idea. And then one thing that I wanted to make you aware of, in that it's happening tomorrow, and we're watching it very closely, talking about engagement. Perhaps some endowments have already divested of BP, but there's a resolution that's being voted on tomorrow, an important one called Aiming for A. It's important to the market, but in particular to CDP, because the A they're referring to in this resolution, and if you're not familiar with what a resolution is, if you own shares in a company, you're able to vote on a number of issues on an annual basis at the general shareholders meeting, and this is shareholder resolution 25 on the docket for BP this year. The vote's tomorrow, and the A in Aiming for A refers to CDP's performance score. So a core group of committed investors have been engaging with high-emitting companies in the UK for the last few years, encouraging them to get to a performance band of A within the CDP performance scoring system. And this has kind of become viral in the activist investor space, and there are now a global group of investors that are supporting this. And there's so much support for it that, in fact, BP is supporting it. So to pass, it needs 75% of the vote. BP is supporting it, as are many large investors like CalPERS, and we fully expect, or we certainly hope, that tomorrow there'll be good news. The things that are being asked as part of this resolution are, of course, achieving an A in your performance score for Shell and BP, but then also doing things like providing a scenario analysis on a range of future carbon prices and what that'll mean for their business, detailing low carbon energy research and development and investment strategies, detailing key KPIs or key performance indicators, as well as executive incentives, and then explaining their public policy interventions. And this last is of particular importance to many investors, because there's a lot of talk about how carbon intensive companies are in fact actively working against policies like setting a carbon price. And so more transparency around public policy and lobbying efforts are critically important. So I'm gonna leave it there and be available to obviously engage in the discussion after all the panelists speak. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for the talk and for the impeccable timing. That was exactly 10 minutes. So I'd like to pose the same question to our next panelist, Marcy Smith from the Responsible Endowments Coalition. Marcy.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's a great question, and the Responsible Endowments Coalition, for those who don't know who we are, is an organization dedicated to supporting student and alumni in particular, activists who are trying to encourage their universities to invest their endowments more responsibly. The first thing that I want to remark on is I think it's an important distinction to make between carbon risk and climate risk. And you can remark more on this during the Q&A, but something that I've heard from many of the universities that we work with, because we primarily work with students and alumni, but we also do work with trustees and administrators, is that they divest, and part of the reason that they divest is they are trying to inoculate themselves from the effects of climate change, right, to protect their portfolio. And it's smart. It's a smart decision in as much as we will very likely have regulation. We certainly will have regulation of the fossil fuel industry. The EPA is issuing regulations on that right now. And the renewable sector is booming, so there are all kinds of threats that the fossil fuel industry faces. And so getting out of that industry is smart and will be good for your portfolio. But once you've done that, and even once you've done your carbon accounting of your portfolio and disclose that, as CDP can help you do, you're still going to have exposure across your entire portfolio to the effects of climate change, which are continuing apace, as unfortunately we all know. You're going to see commodity price volatility, and that's going to disrupt supply chains. It's going to disrupt manufacturing. Natural disasters and erratic weather impact global financial markets. You see expanded ranges of pests impacting agriculture. Unfortunately, here in New York, valuable real estate can be inundated. In other parts of the world, eroded. And then climate change-driven migration and conflict can impact labor markets. So across the entire economy, regardless of whether one divests your individual portfolio, it's not particularly good news. So I just want to make a distinction between those two things, because even conservative investment strategies vis-a-vis the fossil fuel industry are still going to have to answer to the question of how does climate change, in as much as it impacts the economy broadly, how does that impact our returns? How does that impact our stability? So that's one point. Another point, is to answer this question, what comes after divestment? One thought that I had was, well, the new school needs to make sure that it is integrating sustainability across all of its operations, which you all are doing pretty well. I took a close look at your 2011 sustainability report, your climate action plan, actually, is what it is. And the commitments the institution has made to carbon reduction it's really quite impressive. I believe it's carbon neutrality is the aim by 2040. I'm not sure, according to what emission levels, but that's really great news, and I would congratulate you on that. You've been purchasing renewable energy certificates to match 100% of your electricity consumption, which is also great. I think that you're still using a lot of co-generated natural gas, which that could change. You could use solar panels. I think that your point is well taken. The natural gas is different than tar sands, but frankly we don't have a lot of time to deal with this problem. And building out an infrastructure that supports natural gas instead of just going ahead, biting the bullet, and getting renewable clean energy online for the country at large, I think is a bad policy choice. So in as much as the new school as an institution can help push that market, that's really great. And then I think, your climate action plan was drafted in 2011. I think that revisiting that and seeing, are we on track with these goals? That's something for students to look at. It's like, these are really ambitious. I've been campaigning on climate change since I was an undergraduate in Kentucky. And, our president signed the president's climate commitment. I haven't the foggiest idea, what we've done. There's a lot of coal represented on our board, so I imagine not much. But I would encourage you, you have an administration that is open. So, as much as you can green the operations on campus, do that. Advocate for the university to hire you, pay you living wage, salaries to install solar panels during the summer. I think that those kinds of campaigns are compelling, make the link between climate change and economic justice. My third recommendation for the new school would be, to serve as a leader. I mean, you've divested, and I think that is a powerful endorsement of a new moral paradigm that you need to take to others in your field. And that includes, encouraging, pressuring, badgering your peers to also divest. This just occurred to me today, actually, but I think that there should probably be some kind of conference of those who have already divested, to get together and talk about what do we do together? We're a small elite, whose history will see you as a small elite group. So how do you take advantage of that and really, build your power? This may or may not find resonance, but I do think that in the ESG discourse, there's an important message that short-term profit maximization is morally suspect and maybe not the best way to build out your entire global economy. Just as the news is coming in about climate change, I think that there's credible evidence, that brings that into question. And so, in as much as you all can encourage, there are other factors. There are environmental factors, governance factors, social factors that inform the performance of a company. It's not just how much they can deliver to us in the shortest term, it being money. And then, I guess finally, and this is really a recommendation for the divestment movement writ large, is I think that those who have divested and the students who have been successful in getting their institutions to divest really need to start demanding action from the government. You have done your part, and now the government needs to act as well. I think that the divestment movement needs to become a political force in 2016, and you should consult with your lawyers about how to do that within the bounds of the law, of course. But I do think that understanding that climate change is a political issue. We've had the technology for a very long time to deal with this problem. We've had the money to deal with the problem, and there's a lot of money to be made in solving the problem. We have a regulatory structure, the Clean Air Act and Massachusetts versus EPA, which says the government can regulate. So what's the problem? The problem is the fossil fuel industry. So understanding that, higher education is not apolitical, it is very political. Just looking to the impact of the Chicago School of Economics and how that has helped inform the shape of the entire economy, I think is evidence of that. So assuming the stepping into the power that you already have as a key member of the fourth estate, if you will, as you are a really important institution within civil society that can help expand political possibilities. So I really think stepping into that is important, and calling for that government action, right? Because the market is not. If everybody divested tomorrow, we would still have climate change. Divestment is very important, but that alone is not going to deal with the problem. So, and I'm saying that as somebody who is intimately involved in the movement, and intimately involved in the socially responsible investment world. So I think that understanding that this is a collective problem that requires collective action via the state is really important for the investor community to acknowledge and to not indulge these notions that, the invisible neoliberal hand is going to fix all of this, because it's not. And so I think it's really powerful when us, as members of the private sector or as activists within the private sector are doing that, it really makes a difference. One final thought is that, remembering the function of the endowment, that's one of the things as the ED of the Responsible Endowments Coalition that I'm very appreciative of, is that the divestment movement has called into question, what is the purpose of the endowment, right? Who does it serve? Particularly for tax-exempt institutions, for institutions that, that serve beneficiaries, pensions that are serving pensioners, endowments that are serving institutions, students, faculty. And I think it's really important to make a distinction, between the endowment as something that just needs to grow perpetually, you know, and something that needs to grow as much as is necessary, you know, for the benefit of its members. There are lots of interesting cases of, you know, pensions, for example, being invested in the very firms advocating for, you know, destruction of their whole benefit scheme, right? And it's like, how does that work, right? I mean, is that keeping with your fiduciary responsibility to allow that to happen? And I think similarly, endowments are going to start being faced with, and endowment managers and administrators are going to start being faced with these questions. So taking a really, what is actually quite a conservative approach to fiduciary duty, and understanding that the beneficiary comes first, and in the case of the endowment, that means students, faculty, the community, in as much as you're a tax-exempt institution, and understanding that, you know, that relationship of trust is really a quite sacred one, in addition to, you know, being one prescribed by law.
Thank you, Marcy. Very exciting comments. We'll now hear from Paul Alexander Crystal of the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Good afternoon. So I'm actually going to take a slightly different track, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the NRDC did. And we divested. So we, thank you. So we actually were at the forefront of the movement that you guys have moved forward and continue to do so. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the world. There you go. I'll try this. Better? Great. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the world that exists today and the challenges that still exist. So when we decided to divest, we took a good look at the data that was out there, and it's been referenced several times as the 200 list. Part of the problem is that 200 list, you couldn't even invest in about a third of the companies. They're privately held. Then we started to look at who manages the funds, right? These advisors, and we said, well, do we want an active manager, or do we want a kind of a more passive beta strategy? And we said, well, beta strategies are the way to go. So what solutions are out there for that? And there were none. So we actually are the ones who met with and designed with FTSE, which is owned by the London Stock Exchange, a family of indexes that are fossil fuel free. And one of the questions we had was, okay, what does that even mean? And I think that's another big question. What is fossil fuel free? So is it Apple, who makes products and creates carbon, or releases carbon? Or is it the transportation companies that move it? Or is it the company that pulls it up out of the ground? And at the end of the day, we had to make a decision. We decided, okay, what are the companies here that can't change their behavior? And really, those were the extractive industries. And we said, these are the companies we need to target, because we can't pull the carbon out of the ground in the first place. Everybody else can change their behavior. Pipelines, they don't care if they're shipping oil or water. Apple can green their products as much as they have, and will continue to do so. Actually, the former head of EPA is now working with Apple. And so then we said, okay, we've made some decisions. We've talked to FTSE. We've created this thing. What are we going to do now? So we created a publicly available fund, which is for qualified investors, which means endowments and things like that. So not us retail people. And that actually leads me to the question that was posed, which is, what can you continue to do? And so what needs to continue to happen is that the work that's been done with FTSE, these publicly available products and indexes, and then coupled with the continuing efforts of the endowment and also the grading schema for those, we need retail products, because you're all going to graduate, God willing, and go out and get jobs. And most of you will have 401 or 403 plans for your retirement. And when you say, okay, what am I going to do, and how am I going to personally invest my money, you're going to find there are no easy, cheap solutions for you. There are more coming online. The NRDC continues to work with very large brand name companies that you read about all the time in the paper. And products are going to come. but they won't survive unless people continue to advocate their use at the retail level. And the reason why you want these products out there and you want more and more people in them is exactly what Marcy said, which is we need to empower the government to act in our favor against these companies. These companies are huge. They hold tremendous political power, and many, many politicians won't touch them. So we need to empower our own politicians to act on our behalf, tragically. But that's the way you do it. You increase the funds and the number of people, and if you can say 1 million people are invested, even if it's just $10 each, which is not a lot of money, you know, you've got 1 million people out there saying we don't want our money to support these companies. You know, this isn't going to change their stock price. It's not going to change their cost of capital. It's not going to do any of that. What it is going to do is it's going to say, oh, I'm a politician, and I can go out there and run on this platform of caring about the future. So, so that's really where we came from, and what I would hope that you are able to do.
Thank you very much, Paul Alexander. And last but not least is our own Ian Howland of the Advisory Committee on Investor Responsibility. Ian?
Hi everybody, I'm Ian Howland. I'm one of 2 research assistants for HCIR. Brant, who's moderating, is the other one. What I'd like to talk about briefly is how Brant and I, who were basically tasked with coming up with some sort of proposal for the new school to use as a way of coming up with a strategy to implement divestment. We started this, I guess, about a year ago today. It was around the same time Stanford had made an announcement about its divestment from its very, very large endowment from coal. They marketed it as if it were some sort of big fossil fuel divestment strategy, and it was to a certain extent, but what Brant and I were interested in was coming up with some definitions and kind of a concrete strategy that other schools would be able to use. If you looked at Stanford's decision, you wouldn't really be able to see what to do if you were a school trying to do something similar. They said that they had divested from coal. It wasn't clear immediately whether that was just their direct investments or their indirect investments, and it wasn't clear what they actually had in terms of coal to begin with. It was marketed as if it was an environmental stewardship idea. Within a few months, Stanford had added a lot of oil, a lot of shale gas, a lot of different things to their endowment, which made it questionable what they were trying to accomplish with the divestment initiative in the first place. So we really wanted to put a lot of research into figuring out what do we want out of divestment, what does divestment mean, what fossil fuels are we talking about, how do you actually do that, and what does it look like? So we spent a lot of time, we didn't really know what to do at first. We were just kind of looking at, we got information about our endowment, which was challenging enough. I mean, with the amount that's indirect investments, as you said, with smaller schools, that's going to be one of the major parts of your endowment. How do you determine what these companies are? I mean, you have BP, for example, which does oil, but they also do renewable energy, and how do you account for that? There are companies like Mitsubishi Corporation, not Mitsubishi Motors, but the head company, Mitsubishi Corporation, which on paper is an electronics company, but they do a lot of oil exploration, they do coal mining, they do lots of other stuff. So the first question was, how do we determine what these companies are, and then what do we do after that? So what we had looked into were different, first, I'm sure Brant remembers us just digging through Reuters business summaries for companies to see what they were. Obviously, you can't do that for every holding you have in an endowment. It would take decades, I feel like. And of course, by the time you would get through it, things would have changed so much that you don't really know what you're looking at. But we eventually found some benchmarks that gave information. The benchmarks, you have SIC, which is somewhat antiquated right now. You have NAICS, which is the newer version of it, are only officially, for the most part, for domestic companies. So if you go to certain websites, you'll see a lot of information about these various companies, but you're not sure if it's their primary business or if it's some one of the secondary businesses or what exactly the company has to do with fossil fuels and such. So there were a lot of these considerations that we were trying to figure out. What we were able to do is come up with something, a metric, a measurement, something that could be used as kind of creating a report card for an endowment, where you have a score that you're trying to reduce over time. This would be something that looks into what are the worst fossil fuels and using CO2 kilowatts per hour, I think is the official term, but that's something that will be able to see what the carbon intensity is of a given fuel source. I mean, if you're trying to completely reduce carbon emissions from an endowment, it's pretty impractical because even solar power and nuclear power, I mean, there's a decision that has to be made as far as where you're drawing the line. But what this metric does is gives you the opportunity to look at the carbon emissions from each fuel source, see what fuel source is associated with these companies, and see how much money this company, or how much money we have invested into this company. And through that, you have this weighting system, which basically 100, for example, a score of 100 is something that would mean all of your money in your endowment is invested into fossil fuels. Not very likely and not great. That's not where our score is, thankfully. A negative 100, on the other hand, would be everything is in alternative energies. We wanted to, in terms of looking at something that's not just binary in terms of are you divested or are you not, you know, did you get rid of the top 200 or did you get rid of fossil fuels altogether? We wanted something that can, you know, be in line with the impact that we're trying to have as far as environmental stewardship goes. Obviously, investing in alternative energies is going to be helpful. You know, ideally you'd be out of fossil fuels and into alternative energies, but for example, a score of negative 100 would be an endowment consisting of totally alternative energy, and 0 would be where they balance each other out. Currently, the new school, with what we've been able to look at, and I mean, Brant and I, obviously just research assistants, we've been able to get increasing access to the holdings that the new school has in its endowment. We don't have a whole collection quite yet. I think of what we've analyzed so far is between 60 and 70%, and our score currently is about 8.5. So currently, before we've actually implemented any sort of divestment strategy, we do have more fossil fuels in our endowment than we do have alternative energy, with what we've been able to see. So obviously that could change if we were to get a 100% picture of our endowment. So we had worked with FTSE, and they helped us out in getting access to a benchmark that is very widespread. One of the problems with NAICS as a benchmark in determining which companies are fossil fuels was that for international countries, I mean, a lot of the new school's investments are in international countries, and just to make things a little bit more complicated, as we kind of tried to do, just to get as intimate with the idea as possible, was countries, so investments in emerging markets, for example, the transaction costs associated with getting rid of them out of a fund in your endowment is going to be more expensive. So having a metric that can kind of account for, I mean, is it just United States long equity? Is it outside of that? Is that going to be more expensive? And there's some cost-benefit analysis that goes into determining whether or not you're going to go that far. But what we had done was, with FTSE, we were able to get something that's called ICB, which stands for Industry Classification Benchmark, which is a much greater and much more vast collection of industry codes. So we can actually look at our entire endowment, and every single company that's in our endowment is listed in this benchmark, and be able to see if its primary business operations has to do with extracting fossil fuels, producing fossil fuels, and such. Going through that, we're able to take a look at our entire endowment, factor in these things. What type of business is it? What type of fossil fuel is it using? You know, is it alternative energy, or is it just strictly fossil fuels? And be able to come up with these weighted averages that give us this score, that allow us to assess it. And the point of this is that it's something that, I mean, obviously we didn't expect divestment to be flipping a switch and then all of a sudden all the fossil fuel companies are just gone from the endowment. So this is something that you could do at a gradual pace to then reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are in your endowment. So what we wanted to do with this metric is make it something where now if we're able to implement a divestment strategy in a way where it's transparent and that you can see what's being reduced and how the endowment is being changed with regard to climate change, other schools that are considering divestment would actually have something they could look at in terms of this is how we could do it as well. I remember when we first started, we were reaching out to other schools that had big divestment initiatives, Harvard being one of them. I talked to one of the head guys at Divest Harvard, and it asked, you know, we're trying to do this too, have you guys looked into how you're going to divest? And they had said, no, we hadn't gotten there yet. Which was interesting to me because, I mean, Brant and I and a lot of the members on the committee thought that, I mean, what does it say about the efficacy of a divestment movement if you haven't even considered how you're going to do it? So we wanted to, before we even had the decision to divest, come up with some way of doing it to increase the efficacy of driving the initiative and hopefully being able to get it approved. Fortunately, it did, which brings us here to the point of figuring out how to best increase the impact.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for these fascinating comments and ideas regarding this broader issue. I personally have several more questions of interest, but I'd also like to take some time to see if there's any questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we can get you a microphone. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
introduce yourself.
My name is Kendall. I'm in the econ department as well. I guess this question is for Ian. In terms of this industry classification benchmark, I'm wondering if you could just say who created it again, and then do all countries in the world, like, are they trying to get everyone? Because often you'll find it like Mitsubishi or maybe even a Chinese company and you have no idea what they're doing. I'm wondering
Yeah, absolutely.
how easy that is.
So this is the industry classification benchmark is something through FTSE, FTSE, which is a combination of Financial Times and the London Stock Exchange. They're an index company that create a vast range of different indices for businesses to use. So they compiled this list, and it's a privately owned list. It's not like NAICS where you can just go online and find these codes. It's basically this document that they update on a daily basis that has over 70,000 companies. We didn't find anything in our endowment that wasn't in there, but it is something that you have to pay for. FTSE currently is working with a lot of different endowments and financial institutions that are interested in climate change, so they were willing to help us out with getting access to this. What we were able to use was kind of a snapshot of the benchmark to look at it. In terms of other countries, they have information for Chinese companies, Japanese companies, I mean, a wide range. I'm not exactly sure how they get the information from them directly, honestly, but it is one of the more official benchmarks that's out there. Because if you were to go to search for Mitsubishi Corporation NAICS code, you would find a bunch of different codes, but there's no legal entity that's actually verifying these. It's just random companies, organizations attributing these tags to them, so you don't know whether they're trustworthy or not. ICB actually uses a few different benchmarks together to create their own, so they have a much deeper level of classifications that go into a more specific level of industry, so you can see what type of fossil fuel industry it is versus just being in the energy sector, for example. But as far as different countries, I'm not exactly sure how they get the information, but I assure you that it's there.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Charles Allison. I'm on the faculty here at Milano. What do you say to the president of any university that says they don't believe that the endowment should be used as a tool to affect social change? That it's an investment vehicle, full stop. What do you say?
I have thoughts.
Whoever wants to go, please.
Well, one, I think there are different ways to approach that. I mean, I think that there are really, there's compelling historical evidence that that's not true. You know, you can point to history and show that, you know, actually, you know, the endowment has a material impact on the world, and that's useful. You can, I think also, you can also point to the law and point out that, you know, as fiduciaries, you know, of an endowment of a tax-exempt institution, you know, this pool of capital, you know, legally is you know, bound up in the service of the beneficiaries. You know, like it is a purpose-driven pool of capital. You know, universities, for example, aren't required to spend out 5% a year like foundations are, but they are still nevertheless tax exempt, and there's a lot of debate within the legal community as to whether that should be the case. But I think, you know, also, at some point the conversation has to stop, and this is what has been one of the more inspiring dimensions of the divestment movement for me, You know, if you look at Harvard Heat Week that's happening right now, students are just occupying the president's office. You know, it's like, well, you know, we've tried to have these conversations, and now, you know, this is too urgent a challenge, you know, for us to keep having, you know, engaging with you via discourse. You know, we're going to show up with our alumni, and we're going to show that we have built serious political power. And climate, and that's, you know, aside from the conflict and confrontation occurring on some campuses around the issue of divestment, I think we're seeing that happen, you know, within American politics more broadly, that climate change is becoming very polarizing. I mean, in Wisconsin, you just saw, you know, this astonishing decision by the secretary, it's a 3-member board of an agency that manages about $1 billion in state assets and about 77,000 acres of state lands. Just made a decision last Tuesday to prohibit their staff from mentioning climate change, you know, and they're managing forests. You know, it's really exceptional. You know, clearly climate change is becoming a more and more polarized issue, but that's not always a bad thing. You know, Martin Luther King spoke of the sort of need for fruitful tension, and I think that with climate change it's the same. So at some point, I think you can't have a conversation anymore, and you have to instead, you know, have a sit-in.
I would add that, you know, I think it comes down to the question of materiality, and for sort of disbelievers, and it's not just, you know, university presidents. Clearly, you know, if you're talking about what we call a mainstream asset manager, meaning someone who is not an SRI or socially responsible investor that's committed to taking into account environmental, social, and governance issues, but someone who's much more bottom line focused. It's about materiality and what is the impact for a corporation in terms of managing the risks and opportunities associated with climate change risk, just to take one of the natural capital themes that we ask for disclosure on, the others being water and forests. And we've been able to demonstrate through the disclosure that we receive from corporations that there is a positive correlation between the actions they're taking to reduce their emissions. Think about, you know, implementing the change out in lighting, for example. You know, there's an upfront cost associated with doing that as a capital improvement. You know what it's going to cost you on day one. You can also estimate the savings you're going to achieve because it takes less electricity and your so-called payback period. And all of that has an impact on the bottom line. And we've got companies responding to us and giving us details on hundreds of these projects. We aggregate that information and then can pinpoint sort of the impact across sectors and industries, you know, the positive benefits, the net present value positive benefits of doing these things. So when you put it in those terms, the positive bottom line impacts, I think that you can have a depoliticized conversation to a certain extent, up to a point. I mean, obviously, you know, as Marcy says, it's hard to completely disengage people from the emotional and political aspects of these issues, but we found that the facts help.
I'll just speak loudly. So I would actually say that for us, there was a tipping point, because as an institution that had been advocates in many different areas, that question was directly asked. And really the tipping point for us was climate change is unlike any other issue facing society, period. It has the potential to pretty much kill us all. And so this isn't actually about a forest, it's not about the whales, it's not about any particular thing, it's about everything. And so that level of importance carried the day. So that is not a trivial matter.
Can I ask a follow-on to that? What do you say when, sorry. So a follow-on is, what do you say to that investment manager that says, I don't want to push you away from the table. I've got to be in it in order to be able to influence the future, so I need to own. And I need to own in significant enough numbers that I'll be listened to. So that encourages large investment, not medium size, not small, not reducing down to a smaller number. It really encourages maximizing at some level or reaching a point where your voice is loud enough to be heard. I mean, someone quoted CalPERS, I think, and that's who I'm asking about. So what's your answer to the chief investment officer, at CalPERS?
So you're asking how they, how we would advise them to start to really engage and show leadership in these issues?
Well, it's partially that. How do you engage and show leadership? But do you believe the argument that this is the type of issue that you can in fact send a direct message that will be acted upon directly by the companies? Because at some level, you're almost asking some companies to go out of business. Okay?
I think, the fossil fuel industry is unique. And it's unique structurally, it's unique culturally. I think an important distinction to make between, for example, renewables and oil and gas is that one is a commodity and one is technology, and it's very different, and shareholder activism within fossil fuel companies has been happening for 20 years. And so I would encourage you to then ask the manager for evidence to support his or her position. On what basis are they telling you that this is going to be the thing that encourages fossil fuel companies? What altered language in their resolution is going to be the thing that suddenly makes them, come to Jesus? And I don't think that they're going to have a particularly good answer. And, this is a serious issue. Whether you're talking about endowments or pensions, this kind of capture by managers is really a problem. And so I think going to other institutions who use the manager and forming a coalition of sorts and being like, you really have to do this. Or in the case of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, push came to shove and they had to find a new team. But ultimately, managers work for you, and I think that that's an important thing to remember. And they have a very impressive vocabulary frequently, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're smarter than you. And so I think that finding good allies who can help translate, what are they saying? REC right now is working on a project for fiduciaries called Investor Action on Climate, and we're specifically working with investors that have between like 100 million and about 6 billion in assets. And it's like, okay, beyond divestment, what can you do? And we've held a number of charrettes, and that's one of the things we've been hearing is that managers have really been resisting even the conversation about climate change, much less divestment. And so I think that's going to be one of our central recommendations is that, we need to figure out resources for fiduciaries, particularly at small pensions and particularly at endowments, so that people can feel, empowered to hold their managers accountable.
Yeah, I think it's changing, right, in the asset manager space for sure, in terms of if you just look at simple statistics like the number of PRI signatories or the number of CDP signatories, every year it's grown. And each one of the asset managers, and we've got asset owners, asset managers, a good mix of both, but there's always a story behind it. And it could be that they're asset owners, the ones that actually, that they work for, are telling them to do this, but others see an opportunity in the market. They're getting more inquiry. People are asking them what is their SRI or ESG investment strategy, and they don't have one. So they've got to go figure out what that means. I think that asset owners, just like Marcy said, are in the driver's seat. And you can push them, and if you can't push them, then find a new one. But I would think today there are very few asset managers that won't be willing to work on it. A good example is a foundation in Minneapolis, and they made some decisions about what they were going to do, and they started to implement their strategy. They went to one of their existing asset managers, and they all sat at the table and they figured it out together. They came up with a strategy. They found some internal people that were more than willing to get involved with this. And now that asset manager is putting marketing muscle behind this new strategy to roll it out to other clients. I think we've reached a tipping point. The number of asset managers that won't engage at all is small and falling.
I would only add something else to that, which is we heard both that, engagement, which is why when we came to the conclusion that, we really couldn't be in the companies who were in the business of extracting it, they weren't going to engage. So that became a specious argument. But the other argument we continually heard was, well, this will cost us money, right? So that's going to be the follow-up to that. And one of the great things about the public index is the back testing that's going on and the historical returns. So what we found is, going back 5 years, is that no, you don't lose money. That's factually incorrect. We are outperforming the general market, and we've reduced volatility. Because when you look at the companies that we've targeted and we're talking about, these are high-risk companies. And I'm not even talking about stranded assets, right? So there's this concept of stranded assets, that they're being overvalued for the carbon that's still on the ground and they could never pull it up, which is a good argument. I don't have a problem with it. But it's a long-term hypothetical argument, right? Because the regulations that we're talking about haven't come into play yet. What I am talking about is blowouts, right? So BP's never going to surprise me on the upside, by 6 times. But I've watched their market share drop by $6 billion in a day, and that's not volatility that I want exposure to in the first place.
But that's just in the last 6 months.
No. So the nice thing is that because these are public equities, they all have history, right? You can trace back the performance, total return value, going back to whenever they went public. And so FTSE, the people who are putting out the index, went back and did the correlation going all the way back for 5 years. And so during that entire time period, volatility is less and they outperform. So the fossil fuel free
is less in the market as a whole, or
Yes.
less in the sector?
No, less in the market. So by removing these companies, you're reducing your equity volatility and increasing your return. And it's not just the last 6 months. Now, of course, the last 6 months have helped. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
But also, that's exactly another example of it, right? So oil doesn't tend to spike unless there's a massive war. And right now, the Middle East, in about as much chaos as it can be in, oil prices are continuing to decline. Now, of course, I can go into why that's happening, but I'm not going to. But the point of the story is that even over the last 5 years, which have seen tremendous swings in the prices of oil, during that entire period, and this is public information, so it's not like I went out and massaged this data. This is just, you take out these companies and this is what you're going to return. So it is the follow-up, which is you're going to lose money, and that's wrong. So not only should they not try to tell you what to do with your money, but they should also be truthful in what you can expect your returns to be.
Great. We have one more question from the audience, and then I have my own question, and then we'll wrap up and enjoy some really good food.
So in terms of environmental justice, right? So we've talked about climate change and all of that, but I'm also interested in environmental degradation, right? Which impacts particular communities and particular locations. And so as a result involves nuclear, solar, and all of that. So have there been any efforts to kind of focus on that side of, I guess, the extraction industries?
I mean, I'll say that when we do go out to oil and gas companies, we are asking them a comprehensive set of questions across, a number of important axes, including risks and opportunities, and I think strategy, which gets to your question. So, on an individual company basis, I would encourage you to take a look at the responses that we get for any company that you're interested in, and also point out that we score companies on the amount of disclosure that they're providing to us. So 0 to 100, how completely are they answering the question? So that gives you an idea of the resources they put against this effort, where they are in their journey of disclosing, but then also on performance, which is around their emissions reduction performance activities, importantly, but also things like the factor you're asking about, environmental degradation in general. And companies are using this as an opportunity to talk about the positive things they're doing, but the absence of information points up engagement opportunities with the companies, and that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do, is drive investors to take those first steps, implement strategies for their clients, but then most importantly and ultimately engage with the companies to change behavior. So if you see something that's happening in a company, you don't like it, you can let let your committee know. Try to engage with the company directly through your asset managers or otherwise. Yeah.
I would just echo that I think with narrower forms of environmental degradation, there is evidence that shareholder activism can work a bit better. Palm oil has seen at least significant corporate commitments. It's less clear how much sort of scaled implementation of those commitments there's been, but that is heartening. And then I also think, this is a good question for which to mention investment, which is the other part of divest invest, right? And a corollary demand to divesting is to invest in particular things frequently. I know that the New School had some kind of investment pledge that they announced alongside the commitment to divest, and I think that REC has seen students get really excited about investment or reinvestment over the course of the past 6 months, in part, I think, because, it's the opportunity to kind of imagine what sort of economy we want, right? And the cornerstone of the economy is one way to look at it is how we power it. So what is our energy system going to look like? And, as universities are making choices about that, I think that hearing from students and hearing from students about what they want, broadly speaking, the economy of their future to look like should be relevant. So I think that's an important dimension of environmental justice in the context of endowments, is, frequently there's money available once a divestment decision has been made to apply in different places. Is it creating jobs? Is it promoting, energy democracy? Those are things to think about.
For us, that's pretty much how we spend the money we're making in the endowment, is fighting those kind of battles. It's our bread and butter. So the worst players, though, for us, were already pre-excluded. They tend to be the same kind of bunch of bad guys. So it wasn't something we needed to focus on so much because we were very active participants in that space, excluding investments.
Someone else can ask another one. Yeah, I'm just curious if maybe Ian or Brant or Marcy, if you could comment just on the university divestment movement and maybe where you see this expanding from here, and if you think it's just going to go kind of to other private schools and then kind of hit a wall at state schools. And I say that because a lot of state schools have massive geology or engineering programs where even the students themselves are funded by Shell or and I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on the next 5 or 10 years where you see this expanding to.
Great question.
Absolutely. I'd like to say a couple things, and you'll probably be able to say a lot more. But what I would like to say is, one of the things that the New School, or that Brant and I actually tried to think about a lot when we were coming up with this, just kind of in terms of outside of coming up with that investment strategy, how to get people on board with it, was looking at each school individually and using the school's identity to kind of create some sort of impetus for student involvement within divestment. And by that I mean the New School is known generally as a pretty progressive school, and if you, well before the university decided to divest, if you went to thenewschool.com or thenewschool.edu/sustainability, you would see a whole thing about environmental stewardship and about sustainability pledges and all this stuff, but no talk about divestment or anything like that. So one of the things that we looked at in terms of if the president were to ask, why would we do this if it's going to risk with some sort of diversification penalty, which seems to just not exist really in general, would be, well, perhaps there's some sort of admissions enrollment benefit that could come as a result of the New School divesting, in the sense that it has a very growing amount of students interested in environmental studies, in climate action, sustainability. If the New School divests, then it kind of puts it within line of, I guess, just putting its endowment putting your money where your mouth is, I guess. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is, and this was an event actually, Marcy Smith at Mount Holyoke. I went to a student event there, which was to get the conversation started about divestment. And it was interesting because I signed up for it before the new school had decided to divest, but by the time that I got there, the new school had already divested. So it put me in a weird perspective in terms of like, I'm supposed to be thinking how I can get my school to commit to divestment, and already had. So I figured I would just kind of have conversations with other students who were not in the same position I was in. I spoke to an undergrad who went to, it was a small college in Massachusetts, not Mount Holyoke, I don't remember which one, but she was saying, you know, that's all great, you have this progressive institution, it's easy to make that admissions argument. I go to a very small school where there's no environmental studies classes, there's none of these things, how do I get that conversation going? Which makes it a lot difficult, like where's this gonna go if there aren't these progressive institutions doing it? But I think the biggest challenge is to get the bigger schools to do it. I mean, Harvard's had its Heat Week going on, they've had Divest Harvard and its movement for a very long time. If a school like that is able to get through to a divestment strategy, I think a lot of the other schools will I guess understand the efficacy of the initiative a little bit better. But I do think it's important for schools that have divested to really make the biggest impact they can by being transparent and by broadcasting what they've done and how it's worked out to try and get it moving forward. I'm not very keen on forecasting as a new school economics student. So I don't want to say too much about where I expect it to be, but I mean, I do believe the momentum's changing. I honestly didn't expect the new school to announce its divestment decision at the time that it did. I personally expected it to take longer. So there are some surprises involved. University of Syracuse just recently made a divestment commitment. So there, you know, schools in New York, hopefully the bigger schools in New York, the bigger schools in Limelight will be able to do it, and that will be the best way.
Thank you. So now I finally get to ask my question. My question, which is, I want to thank the panelists because I think all of you integrated the aspect of how can students get involved with your answers, which I think is completely appropriate for this conversation. But I think the follow-up question, which I think is just kind of related, is what kind of job opportunities or marketable skills could involvement in these kinds of issues help cultivate for students? And anybody can take it off. I know I've sprung this on you now, so if anybody wants to take a moment to think about this, fine.
I'll start off. You know, in terms of skills, I come from a Wall Street background. I worked on Wall Street for like 20 years. And it was really about educating myself, networking, taking classes, and really just enthusiastically trying to gain a comprehensive, or as much as I could, not working in it directly, a comprehensive set of information that was going to help me start walking the walk and talking the talk. So I think there's a lot of personal initiative that can do it. Speaking more to what some of the people that are staffs, you know, that our staff's made up of, for example, at CDP here in New York, there are sustainability programs now at some of the leading universities that are good feeds for us in terms of staff, and so those types of environmental and sustainability focused classes can really help as well.
Well, I know who's looking for work. I'm just trying to think, you know, the people who come to the NRDC, either in the finance group or in any of our programs, have just hugely diverse backgrounds. And really what brings it all together, though, is a knowledge of the subject matter that you care about, right? So if you have a part of this equation, which is complex, there's so many different aspects to it, dive into that part of it. That's being able to speak in depth on a particular facet is what will help you land a job.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So again, I want to thank all of our lovely panelists today. I also want to thank all of you for being here, and as well as the USS for sponsoring this event, the ACIR for organizing it, and Dan and Emily at Useful Media for taping it. So thank you very much for coming today.